Hello you guys, welcome back to my channel. I am very excited for today's video. One, because I currently have my air turned off and it's 93 degrees outside, and so once I finish filming I'm turning my air on. And your girl she's sweating. But two, today we are going to be talking about my top 10 most loved eyeshadow palettes in my collection since I started to track my palette usage, which was all the way back in 2020. So we are at about the 4.5 year mark, and I have my top 10 most loved palettes of all time. So, well, of the past 5 years. But I would venture to say most of these, like, I don't think there's a lot well, okay, I'm gonna stop. In the past 4.5 years, these are my top 10 most loved eyeshadow palettes. And spoiler alert, I only have half of them still in my collection. I have not been doing a great job, like, getting a ton of use out of my palettes these days. We could definitely do better. But anyway, if you are interested in which 10 palettes have gotten the most love from me the last 4.5 years, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit chatting about makeup, I'd love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. One of my skills, you guys, is I can burp like from the depths of my core, and I wish I could tell you guys how many like loud burps I had to like edit out. One of these days I'm gonna share one with you guys, but anyway, I just burped. You're welcome for that information. Okay, I'm gonna go from like the least used of the top 10 all the way to my most used. But before we do that, I want you to pause the video and I want you to go type with your fingers on the keyboard or your phone, and I want you to let me know if you can name, just toss out a palette or two that you think are gonna be my most used. I always love reading the comments on videos like this because you guys are usually spot on. I swear you know my collection better than me. But we are gonna start with the 10th most used palette of the, I'm gonna just round up and we're gonna say 5 years. So that palette is the Too Faced Palm Springs palette, and I'll post a picture of it over here because I don't own this palette anymore. And it's really funny because when I was putting this list together, I was like, okay, I can like definitely tell when I stopped doing Pan Those eyeshadows, because some of the palettes that are in my top 10 were palettes that I was working on in like Pan Those eyeshadows. So specifically trying to pan like one eyeshadow from the palette. That's why some of these palettes got so much use. So the Too Faced Palm Springs palette, I was trying to pan, I believe it was the cream like lid setting shade. So while it got 46 uses, I rarely use this palette to actually create a full look with it, which is why I personally have transitioned into doing the No Pan Left Behind, and I love doing that. Yes, not all of my palettes, like there's not as many palettes that have 20, 30, 40 uses on them, but I'm definitely spreading the love across my palette collection more and actually using a palette to its like capacity, like one palette to create a look, whereas in the past I would use 8 different palettes, one shade from each of those palettes to create a look. So it's like not really getting use out of the palette as a whole, at least the way that I was doing my makeup. So Too Faced Palm Springs I used 46 times, and that is something that is now decluttered. Next, number 9, I have the Urban Decay Born to Run palette, and I absolutely loved this eyeshadow palette, and I would venture to say that this would be closer to like the 70-80 mark if I had been tracking like 2017, 18, and 19. I can't remember exactly when this palette launched, but before I started tracking use, I used this palette. I would even like venture to say I may have used this palette over 100 times because I had multiple pans in that palette, and those pans, I remember working on one of the brown matte shades, and I swear it took me over like 45 uses just to hit a pan, and I swear that was in 2019. So I would venture to say I was over 100 if I had like been tracking prior to 2020. But from 2020 and beyond, the Urban Decay Born to Run palette got 47 uses for me. This is now also decluttered in my collection. I just wasn't loving the quality of this anymore, but I definitely absolutely loved that palette. Again, I had multiple pans in that palette. It had definitely been in multiple projects, but I did really enjoy using a majority of that palette. There were definitely some dead shades in there though. Coming in at number 8 is a palette that I do still own in my collection. It is a Pat McGrath palette, and it makes me so happy to see a Pat McGrath palette as one of my most used palettes because these puppies are not cheap. But my Pat McGrath Bronze Seduction palette I have reached for 48 times in its lifetime with me. I have a pretty good dip going on this gold shade up here. It's like one of my favorite golds in my entire collection. I also have reached for this green like shimmer glitter topper shade so many times. Like I swear at least half of the uses are this green shade, but there's like not even much of a dip at all going in that. And I swear it's because just of the like type of formula, but I absolutely wow, frog in my throat. I absolutely love this eyeshadow palette. It is stunning, beautiful, and I would love to see this palette get over 100 uses at some point in its life with me. Coming in at number 7 is another eyeshadow palette that is still in my collection. It is my Natasha Denona Mini Nude Eyeshadow Palette, and I have reached for this a total of 49 times. Now, I will say this specific palette has not gotten 49 uses. I actually owned this palette, and I used it so much that it was like really starting to fall apart, and I already feel like this one is kind of starting to fall apart too. My previous palette had, I believe, 1 or 2 pans in it, but I love the Natasha Denona Mini Nude. It is one of my go-to eyeshadow palettes if I just want to like do a look without having to think about it. I always love the way that my look turns out, and I love that this has a bit of versatility. Like if I want something warm and bronzy, I can go this direction. Like I can use the mattes and use this. I always use this shade on my inner corner, but then if I want something a little bit different, maybe a little bit of like a green undertone, I can reach into Sienna, which I love the shade Sienna. So I know that I will continue to use and love this eyeshadow palette as well, and I would love to see this cross 100 uses at some point as well. And actually tied for that in spot number 6 is an eyeshadow palette that I don't own anymore, but it's the ABH Mario palette. And again, if I had been tracking my uses prior to 2020, this palette would have gotten even more than 49 uses. I am absolutely certain of it. Again, I think this one would be possibly pushing the 100 use mark. I did finally decide to declutter this eyeshadow palette because it really was starting to decline in terms of its use. I just felt like the shadows weren't lasting on my lids as long, but I had so many pans in that palette, and that was just like, if they were to re-release that palette, I think I would go stand in line. Like I might pitch a tent and camp overnight for that palette if I had to. Probably not. I am many things, but a nature camping girl is not one of them. But I would do a lot to get my hands on like a brand new ABH Mario palette. So if they were to re-release that, that would be awesome, and I would definitely purchase again. All right, coming in at number 5 is a palette that I do still have in my collection. It's my ColourPop Lil Ray of Sunshine. Now this is an eyeshadow palette that I was working on in a pan those eyeshadows, and specifically I was focused on this right here, which does have a pan in it. ColourPop matte shadows specifically take a long time to hit pan in, and this is 9 pans of mattes. So I reached for this palette a total of 53 times. Now granted, it wasn't just this shade that I reached for 53 times. I still love this eyeshadow palette. I think it's really beautiful, and I will say I've been enjoying like an all matte look from time to time. It's so hard for me to say that because I'm such a like metallic shimmer girly, but I've been liking to lean into like just a simple matte look these days, and I'm really excited to pull this out for the summertime. I feel very inspired. I should do a yellow look with this yellow before summer's over. I really should set this out to just remind myself. There's so many like palettes and shades that I want to use. It's before the end of the summer or whatever. I'm like, ugh. And I haven't been great at doing my makeup this summer because I've been like trying to do activities. But anyway, I love this eyeshadow palette. I would also love to see this one cross 100. This is something I anticipate will be in my collection for still a long amount of time. I haven't thought about decluttering this palette at all, so we'll see where that one lands next time I do a video like this. Which I would love your feedback in the comments below. Like, should I start doing maybe like a 100 club for eyeshadow palettes, or even like a 50? Maybe like a 50 club would be more realistic, just because I only have 2 palettes over 100 since I've been tracking. And with doing no pan left behind, it's not like I'm really hyper focused, but maybe I could start doing like a palette 50 club where I share all the palettes that have gotten like 50 uses. Let me know if you'd be interested in something like that. It would take me some time, probably, possibly even years to get to that, seeing as only 5 palettes in my current collection have been used 50 times in the last 5 years. Okay, palette number 4 I don't currently own, but I'm so glad that this got so much use because it was a pricier palette, especially for at the time. And I had lusted after this palette for so long. It's the Color Green Queen of Hearts eyeshadow palette, and I reached for this a total of 70 times. Now, I was working on this, I have worked on this palette in multiple different projects. I did have a pan in one of the shades, and I actually have depotted and kept a couple of the shades from that palette, but I was kind of surprised to see that this had been used 70 times, because I remember having a really hard time letting go of this eyeshadow palette, and that could be because this was an eyeshadow palette that when I first started getting into YouTube, everyone was talking about, and I kept thinking about it and kept thinking about it and kept thinking about it before finally purchasing it. So maybe that played a part in it, but I felt like every time I wanted to declutter it, I was like, oh, I barely use this. And then there's other palettes in my collection that I'm like, oh my gosh, I love this palette so much. I use it all the time, and I've reached for like 5 times. So I think it's really, that's why it's fun to track your usage sometimes, because it really, like, there's times that I'm like, it's like crazy. I think I use a product all of the time, and I like actually barely use it. So anyway, the Color Green Queen of Hearts eyeshadow palette got 70 uses from me in its lifetime. At least, I think maybe I owned this palette too before I started tracking, so probably even more than 70 uses. Coming in at number 3, I'm so happy that this is in my top most used palettes, because I would seem like such a liar if this was not. This is my ABH Jackie palette, my favorite ABH palette of all time, and honestly one of my absolute favorite palettes ever of all time of owning. I just have such a fondness for this palette. And I will say, when I first purchased this palette, I was definitely like, Sponsored was my favorite shade, but I think now Zam is my favorite shade, and I honestly, like, I don't even have a pan in this palette yet, or in this shade yet, so I should try and do that this year. But I have reached for this eyeshadow palette 73 total times since I started tracking, and I believe this launched in 2019, possibly towards the end of 2019, but maybe even 2018, I'm not sure. But definitely use this prior to starting to track this palette. I do have only 3 pans in this palette, actually, with using it 73 times, which does actually feel kind of crazy, especially for ABH. And I will say the shade Big Wig only has a pan because I was frankening that shadow with a different shadow, so I really only would have 2 pans. Now, I do have a good dip going on Zam, and I do have, like, I'm very close to hitting pan on edges, but 73 uses and only that number of pans in an ABH palette actually feels really, really good. I still feel like the quality of this palette performs really well. I don't really have any issues with, or any qualms with, any of the shadows, so I anticipate I'm going to keep this palette as long as I can until I truly feel like the shadow quality is just not there at all. So I'm excited to see where we land in terms of usage for the ABH Jackie. All right, my top 2 eyeshadow palettes have both gotten over 100 uses in the amount of time that I've been tracking these palettes. Coming in at number 2, I have my Dose of Colors Baked Browns eyeshadow palette, and I have a completed shade in this palette as well as 2 pans. It is an all matte palette, and when I first purchased this palette, I actually wonder when I first purchased this, because I think I got a lot of use out of it when I first purchased this, which I believe was prior to 2020, and then in 2020 I got a ton of use out of it because I was trying to pan it, and then I got a ton of use out of it this year because I was working on completing this shade. So 109 tracked usage with this one. This is something that I do really still enjoy keeping in my collection, just because I feel like it's nice to just have some simple matte browns. Like, if I just want an all matte look, or if I just want one brown matte, I really have a good variety in this palette, even though there's only 4 shades. It's kind of like a palette you don't really have to think about, but it also just is a very utilitarian palette. Like, I can get kind of what I need for a matte brown from this palette. I enjoy using it, and clearly I have used it a lot. And then my number 1 most used eyeshadow palette in my collection is no longer with me because I did declutter it at the end of last year. It was the palette that I was working on in my one and only pan that palette that I've ever done, and that is my ABH Sultry palette. And I will say I did reach for that palette 202 times last year, and total in its lifetime I reached for it 293 times. By no means had I finished every single shade. I feel like I actually failed miserably at a pan that palette. It was an eye-opening experience for me, and I don't think I'll ever do a true pan that palette ever again. But I loved the ABH Sultry palette. I will say I haven't necessarily had the desire to, I know they did, I don't know if they still do, have like the Sultry Mini. I have no desire to own it again, probably because I got so much use out of it. I had no issues with it. I think it's an absolutely stunning palette. It was beautiful, clearly I used it so much. But you know, I hope maybe one day we can get ABH Jackie up to over 300 uses. That would be a feat. But my most loved eyeshadow palette of all time currently was my ABH Sultry palette. And that is it for today's video. Those are my top 10 most used eyeshadow palettes since I started tracking my palette usage. As I mentioned, I would love to get your guys' feedback on your most used eyeshadow palette in the comments down below. Thank you so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting me and my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.